ACT, reading, comprehension. Circular reasoning is a type of logical fallacy, and a logical fallacy is basically a failure of reasoning. So it's important as a reader to recognize logical fallacies because they diminish the value of the author's message. So since circular reasoning is a type of logical fallacy, we could also call circular reasoning a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we can define it as reasoning that offers no support for assertions other than restating them in different words. So another way to define this is we could say circular arguments refer to themselves as evidence of truth. So if you find an argument that refers to itself as evidence of truth, then you know it's a circular argument. Now, circular reasoning is one of the more difficult logical fallacies to identify because it is typically hidden behind dense language and complicated sentences. Now, a simple example of circular argument is when a person uses a word to define itself. Like right here where it says niceness is the state of being nice. So if you as the reader do not know what the word nice means, then this sentence won't be of very much help to you. Now, right here we have a little bit of a more complicated example, and this is what you are more likely to find in your reading. It says poverty is a problem for society because it creates trouble for people throughout the community. So it is redundant to say that poverty is a problem because it creates trouble. So when an author engages in circular reasoning like this right here, it is either because he or she has not fully thought out the argument or because they cannot come up with any legitimate justifications. Classified advertisements, or ads or classifieds as they often can be called, are used for a few main purposes: to sell or buy goods, and to attract business. Classifieds can often be found in newspapers and in online listings. There is pretty much one format that is used for classifieds, and this is a title with a word or phrase that helps the reader understand what the person is trying to buy or sell or what their business is about. Then under the word or phrase is a description about the word or phrase that was at the top. Oftentimes, the writer of the classified is charged per word that they use, so abbreviations are very common. They use these abbreviations to limit the amount of words they are using to try to put as much information as possible into as small of a space as possible. Then after the description will be a price the person is selling something for, or the price they're willing to pay for something. And then there will be contact information, which will generally be a phone number or an email address so that the person can get in contact with them about the classified that they put up. So the important thing to draw from this is that classifieds are used for a few main things: to sell or buy goods and to attract business. An essay where you are asked to compare and contrast is extremely prevalent and very popular, so you're probably going to be asked to write one of these types of essays at some point. So it's important that you are prepared to do that. So look at this example: running and swimming as forms of exercise. So in this example, you'd be asking to compare and contrast running and swimming. So look at running and swimming and talk about how they are alike. That's the compare part of it. And the contrast part is talking about how running and swimming are different. But remember, you're not just talking about running and swimming. you're talking about them as forms of exercise. So think about how running and swimming are similar in terms of exercise and how they are different forms of exercise as well. So there are a few things to remember when writing one of these essays. First, have purpose. Don't just compare and contrast something just to do it. Have some kind of purpose, like that way your reader can determine which is the best form, or sometimes it's to show your reader which is the best choice. Then pick your style. Sometimes you can go back and forth, like you can talk about how running and swimming are alike in this way, and then talk about how they're alike in this way. Or you could just talk about running, keep talking about running, and then talk about swimming. So the choice is talk about running and then swimming, or talk about running and swimming back and forth throughout the entire essay. The choice is yours, just decide which one is most effective. And then finally, derive purpose. Now I know I just put that up there, but it's very important. Don't just write an essay where the reader comes to the end of it wondering why they even read your essay. Give them some kind of purpose to comparing and contrasting the things that you have been talking about through the entire paper. So remember those things, and you'll be on your way to writing a great essay. Many times readers come across words that they are unfamiliar with. So it's important that readers understand how to determine the definition of a word based on its context. This means looking at the words around it and how the word is used in the sentence. Let's look at a couple of examples. This first example says, the elderly scholar spent his evenings hunched over arcane text that few other people even knew existed. So the unfamiliar word here is arcane, but you will see that you can pretty much determine the definition of that word based on the words around it. Here we see the word elderly coming before scholar. So if only an elderly scholar would be studying these texts, then it means that it must be some kind of complex subject that only someone who has acquired much knowledge and wisdom would understand. And then we also see that it says that few other people even knew existed. So that means it's something rare or something that only a few people would know about. So here we have easily and quickly determined the definition of arcane. This next sentence says, Ron's fealty to his parents was not shared by Karen, who disobeyed their every command. Now you'll notice here that there's not very many words that tell us the definition of fealty. Instead, we see words that tell us what fealty is not. Because here it says, Karen, who disobeyed their every command. Here, Ron is being contrasted with Karen. So if fealty is not disobeying their every command, then fealty must mean obeying or being faithful to. Because notice here we're seeing that Karen disobeys their every command, but Ron does not. So Ron must mean not disobeying. In other words, it means obeying. So you see here how by looking at context clues, a reader can quickly determine the definition of a word. And although it may not be the exact definition, it generally will be the definition for that word in that particular sentence. And so this can be very helpful because it helps a reader be more efficient, because determining the definition of a word based on context is much quicker than consulting a dictionary or a thesaurus.
Historical context. Historical context can impact literature in a number of ways. The author's writing can be impacted by the historical period during which it was written, or the historical setting of the story. For instance, when Charles Dickens was writing, he was writing during a period where authors were paid by the word, which meant that his novels were very, very long. And that was the result of the time period during which his work was written. He was writing long novels because he knew he would get paid more for every word that he wrote. Dialect is something else you can pay attention to. The dialect could be what the author is used to using in his everyday life, or the dialect could be more related to the historical setting of the story. So dialect is something you want to pay attention to and ask yourself, is this the dialect used during the setting, or is this more of just the author using his own personal dialect that he's used to? Another thing to pay attention to with historical setting is major events that are going on. You want to be familiar with the time period during which a story is set so you can have a better understanding of it. So, one example is the Civil War. during the Civil War, slavery was the normal thing in the South. And whenever the Civil War is over, lots of slaves or people that used to be slaves wanted to tell their story. And so what came about were slave narratives. And these painted a picture of what slave life was actually like during that time. It was an actual account from that time period. And it kind of also told the relationship between slaves and slaveholders. So that source of writing is very valuable, and it's become one of the most important literary genres for African American writers. Today, people may still write from that perspective in that time period, but the actual slave narratives that gave first-hand accounts were very important. Another thing to pay attention to with Civil War writing, slave narratives, anything from that time period are the themes. A lot of times you'll see themes of power, race, inequality. Because when slavery ended, it was because people were saying, your skin color doesn't make you more or less of a person or a better or worse person. Everyone's equal. And while equal rights didn't come about till later, it started that theme of equality around the Civil War time. Another major event that's common is World War II. There are countless novels based around World War II events, whether it's based in Nazi Germany, whether it's based in America, as people are dealing with what was going on here. But one of the biggest things that you'll see is the topic of genocide, destroying a whole race. So your Jewish Nazi relations, you're going to see a lot of. Anne Frank, very, very popular book, one that most people are going to know about, was based on this. And if you know the World War II era, then you know what to expect when you're reading. You know that the Nazis are trying to take over most of Europe. You know that the Jews are being persecuted, and you've already got that bit of background knowledge before you even read the rest of the book. And with World War II novels, you're again going to see themes of race, power, and democracy, because in the end, people were going to say that having a government where some totalitarian dictator took over everything wasn't the best way to be. And you're going to see people highlighting the pros of democracy. So whenever you're reading, really pay attention to the historical context of the story, because the historical period during which it was written is always going to have an impact, and the historical setting is going to be very important for you to understand, so that you can understand why the author gave the character certain motivations and why the author carried out the plot as they did. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So, knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor, but because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying, because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed. Or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Persuasive essays. When writing a persuasive essay, the writer will try to convince the reader to adopt the opinion of the writer on a particular issue. They do this in many different ways, but they should demonstrate a keen understanding of their audience. You need to know who you're writing to, who you're trying to convince of this opinion. Consider the interests, prior knowledge, and learning styles of the audience. So think about who you're writing to. Are they going to be interested in this topic to start with, or are you going to have to get them interested? Are they going to have any prior knowledge about this, or is this the first time they're going to be reading about it? How do they learn? What's the best way that you could support your thesis so that they would eventually adopt your opinion? These are all things to think about when you're writing. At the beginning of every essay, you're going to want to develop your thesis. Now, the thesis is going to be in the introduction of your persuasive essay, but it's going to be at the end, not at the beginning. So in most papers, your thesis will be at the beginning of that introductory paragraph, but not in a persuasive essay, because in a persuasive essay, you want to establish credibility first. You want to win the trust of the audience, or at least their interest, before you tell them what you're trying to convince them of. And one way to do this is to use an anecdote or story. If you start off your paper with a short anecdote or story, it kind of warms the audience to you. You may give them a little bit more information that lets them know you are a credible source to be talking about this topic, and then introduce your thesis. Then introduce what it is you're going to be trying to convince them of in this persuasive essay. Now, once you've established your thesis, there are several ways that you can develop it, but we're going to discuss 3 different persuasive essay techniques today. One is making claims. You're going to give lots of supporting ideas to your main argument, so you should have small claims along the way that support the central argument. You make one big claim at the beginning when you tell people what it is you're writing about, what it is you're trying to convince them of, but you're going to make several small claims along the way that support that central argument. Claims should be rooted in fact and observation. These claims cannot be something that is just your opinion. It can't be something you made up. You can't say, I think chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. You could say, I think an ice cream parlor should serve more varieties of chocolate ice cream. And you could back that up by going and doing some research, looking to see what kind of money the store might make if they had different ice cream flavors. And you could back it up. There's facts, there's observations, there's statistics you could look at. But if you just say, chocolate's the best, there should be more chocolate, that's just your opinion. It's not a small claim that would be confirmable. And that leads us to this part. Must be confirmed. Any facts that you include, any observations must be confirmable. You must be able to go back and show where you found them, show that it's a true statement. So, with any persuasive essay, include references when possible. Show where you got this information. Don't make the reader go find it. Present it to them to show that you are being upfront about this. What you're saying is true. What you're saying is the right thing, and they should believe you. It further establishes trust with them. Another way that you can develop your thesis is with examples and expert opinions. Examples are most effective when they complement facts. So you've laid out some facts and observations. Now give some examples that support those, because examples are a good way to make dry facts more interesting or understandable. Sometimes a writer will present a fact and you'll say, I don't really know what they mean by that. But if they give you an example to back it up, then you say, oh, that's what they meant. So using an example can make your audience understand what you're trying to tell them better and make it more interesting, because sometimes facts are dry and hearing a lot of facts in a row may just be boring and may not actually pull your reader's interest toward that opinion you're trying to convince them of. If you use an expert opinion, your expert should have a title or credential of some sort that clearly indicates the expert's knowledge and experience in the topic. So if you're saying someone is an expert on, let's say, a certain drug, then you may want the doctor to be there to say, oh, well, amoxicillin really does have all these health benefits, and here are all the things that I can tell you about that. You want a doctor. You want him to be able to show he's got a degree in medicine. You don't want it to be just someone that comes on and says, oh yeah, I've given my kid Amoxil several times and my kid always gets better after a cold. That's not what you want. You want someone who's got verifiable credentials to be an expert. Now, we've looked at making claims using facts to support your thesis and using examples and expert opinions to back those up, but you can also look at emotional appeals. Opinions are formed by emotion as well as reason. So these are going to play more on reason, more on logic, where emotional appeals are going to pull on a reader's emotions. These should be used in a proper and ethical manner. And that's important to remember. If you're going to appeal to a reader's emotions, you need to be responsible about it and make sure you're doing it the right way. And let me show you some examples to expand on that. Think about drunk driving ads. Sometimes you may see some really sad and graphic things in those ads, but what's being shown is shown to you to let you know that this is a serious issue, that people should not drive after drinking because there can be terrible consequences. Anyone using that information should be using it to support not drinking and driving. And so even though it's pulling on your emotions, it's doing it for a good reason. But then let's look at politics. A lot of times, one candidate will put out an ad saying how patriotic they are, showing how they've served their country and all the ways they're patriotic. And that's really nice, but often it's going to also imply that the other candidate competing against the first one is not very patriotic, and that's usually far from the truth. Meanwhile, that first candidate's patriotism is going to link them to voters. Voters are going to say, oh, I really care about the country too, so I need to go with this guy because he's patriotic and the other one isn't, even though that's not true. So you don't want to mislead your audience with emotional appeals. And one other way that can be done is with loaded language. If someone is extremely religious and they're called a fanatic, the word fanatic has a certain connotation to it that is negative. The same way if someone was environmentally conscious and someone called him a tree hugger, that has a negative connotation. So using loaded language words like that can give negative connotations and pull on a reader's emotions that way. And that's not what you want to do. You want to use it to support your argument, but not put down other things. So whenever you're writing a persuasive essay, make sure you're keeping in mind who your audience is, what their interests are, how much they may already know about the topic, and what's going to help them the most. And then you can decide if you want to use small claims along the way, expert opinions and examples, or emotional appeals to back up your thesis. But the most important thing you're going to need to do is to win your audience's trust. You want to establish that you're credible so that you can convince them that your opinion is the correct one. Purpose. An author writes with one of four purposes in mind: to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. Once we figure out which one of these four purposes the author is writing with, we will be able to better understand his or her motivations for writing. If the author is writing to inform, it will probably be nonfiction. And some examples you might see are research papers or recipes. You are getting information. The author is informing you of something. They're informing you how to do something. It's nonfiction. Their purpose is simply to inform you. If the author's purpose is to describe, it will probably be fiction. And it's going to have lots of details. A descriptive story or paper is going to elaborate on details. It's going to give you as much description as possible, and a lot of times that's going to be something that's a work of fiction. While you will have details in an informational paper or writing of some sort, it's not going to be the same kind of details you'd get in a descriptive fictional narrative. If the author's purpose is to entertain, then it will also probably be fiction. And you will have humorous and or dramatic elements. Now, something that's funny or humorous is going to be entertaining, but something dramatic can be just as entertaining as something funny. And some of the best stories are going to have humorous and dramatic elements in them. So something written to entertain is usually fiction, and it will sometimes have both of these elements, or sometimes just one or the other. But it's written to entertain you, to make you feel entertained, like you are reading a story that you are enjoying. If the author is writing to persuade you of something, you are probably going to see an editorial or an advertisement. All those ads you see on TV are meant to persuade you to buy something, persuade you that one product is better than another. So that is where advertisements are going to be one of the primary places that you see persuasion writing. An editorial in a newspaper may lean toward or against a certain topic or candidate in a political campaign, and so those are also written to persuade you one way or the other. But most people are going to see ads on almost a daily basis, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on the TV, whether it's on a billboard driving down the highway. So this is something you'll see every day, whether you're trying to or not. So the four main purposes an author will write with are to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. And once you determine what the author's purpose in writing is, you will better be able to determine the author's motivation for crafting his work.
ACT, reading, comprehension. An overgeneralization is a type of logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And so that is what an overgeneralization is, a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we could define it as when an author makes a claim that is so broad it cannot be proved or disproved. So when an author uses an overgeneralization, it's usually to accomplish one of two motives. The first is to create an illusion of authority. So the author may want to make it look like they have authority when in fact they do not. The second possible motive is to sway the opinion of the reader. Usually, this would be accomplished by using sensational language. And so if the author was writing a persuasive essay, he may employ the use of overgeneralization to sway the opinion of the reader. Now, take a look at this example right here of overgeneralization. Everybody knows she is a terrible teacher. Now here, the author makes an assumption that cannot really be believed. It may be that most people do indeed have a negative view of the teacher, but to say that everybody feels that way is an exaggeration. Here, the author is claiming consensus when none actually exist. Now, when a reader spots an overgeneralization like this one, they should become skeptical about the argument that is being made, because an author will often try to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language. So if you see a statement like this and you can recognize it as an overgeneralization, know that that means that the author is probably trying to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language. A technical passage is a piece of writing used to describe a complex object or process. So that's the main point of a technical passage, to describe a complex object or process. Because of that, a technical passage is always going to be nonfiction. Many times, technical passages will relate to something in the medical or technological fields. I'm just going to abbreviate technological. So technical passages could be about many different types of fields, but generally things in the medical and technical fields are complex, so that's why a lot of technical passages will relate to those fields. So the goal of an author when writing a technical passage is to state everything simply and clearly. In order to accomplish that goal, the author has several tactics it will often use to state everything simply and clearly. The first is by putting everything in a logical order. The second tactic is to use subheadings and headings. And the third tactic is to use letters and numbers. That sounds very vague, but what I'm talking about here is by numbering the main points or using letters to separate sections of the paper. And because of using lots of subheadings and headings and letters and numbers, oftentimes a passage will appear more like an outline than an actual piece of writing. But nevertheless, that's fine, because the goal of the writer here is to describe the complex object or process simply and clearly. So that's the important thing to pay attention to there. So just to review, a technical passage is for the purpose of describing a complex object or process. And everything needs to be stated simply and clearly, so the three tactics an author can use are logical order, subheadings and headings, and letters and numbers. A bias is basically when an author is unfair or inaccurate in his or her presentation of something. In their attempt to persuade, writers often make mistakes in their thinking patterns and writing choices. This is because every author has a point of view. And that's important to remember. every author has a point of view, which is basically just the way they look at something, the way they see a certain situation. So because they have this point of view, naturally in their writing, they oftentimes will show their point of view through their writing. And so that's when a bias comes into play. So it's not necessarily bad for an author to have a point of view. They're just naturally going to have one. But it is a problem when they start to include it in their writing. So that's when a bias comes into play. And so a bias is when someone ignores reasonable counter-arguments or distorts opposing viewpoints. So you as a reader need to be aware when an author is being biased. So look for any clues, like when they only talk about their own arguments for something and don't talk about any opposing ideas. Or when you are aware of another viewpoint and they share the viewpoint, but they don't share it exactly correct. So be aware of those types of things. And then once you are tipped off once that a writer is being biased, you will know that other times when they present opinions, that those opinions may also be biased. A great source of information is the card catalog. And although card catalogs rarely exist in the form of pieces of paper, they can often be found online in most libraries. And these card catalogs offer a wealth of information about the contents of that library. So on a typical card catalog entry, it will include the title of that book, the author of the book, the year of publication, number of pages, the reference number in the Library of Congress, and the library call number for that particular library. So all of this information here helps readers find a particular book that they're looking for, that they might want to read, and then find that book in that particular library. So you notice here the last thing that's on a card catalog is the library call number. So that's the numbers that the reader looks for to find that book in that library. And so they can look over this information to find out if they want to read that book. So they might come across this book, but they're looking for something that'll be a real quick read. So they look at the number of pages, or maybe they are looking for an older book written in older English. So they can look at the year of publication to find an older book. Or maybe a reader already knows which book they want to read, so they look it up by title, and then they find the library call number. In addition to all of this information, card catalogs often contain a summary and links to find books by the same author or subject. So summaries are very helpful because if a reader is looking for books, they can come across a book and they might like the author and they might like the title of it. Then they can read a summary to see if they're interested in reading that book or looking through that book for certain information. And then also a great thing about card catalogs being online is that it can offer links to looking for other books by the same author or subject. So someone might be looking at a card catalog and they see the title of the book, and they like the subject material that the book is on, but they don't want that particular book. So they could click on the subject of the sentence or the title and then find a list of other books that have similar titles. Or maybe they are looking at a book by a particular author and they like that author, so they want to look for other books by him or her. So they can click on the author and then find a list of books that are also written by that author. So as you can see, card catalogs offer a wealth of information about the contents of a library. The text used to support an argument must be credible, or another word for credible would be believable. And it's important for writers to be credible so that the reader will believe their writing. So there's a couple of important things that an author should do in order to be credible. First, they need to be knowledgeable on the subject. And second, they need to be unbiased. So when we talk about being knowledgeable, I'm saying that the writer needs to understand what they are writing about. Consider if you were looking at two reports about the ozone layer. One was written by an environmental scientist and the other by a hairdresser. You are more likely to believe the report written by the environmental scientist than the report about the ozone layer by the hairdresser. Why? Because the environmental scientist knows more about the ozone layer, or at least you believe that they do. So that's why it's important to be knowledgeable in order to be believable. And the second important trait is to be unbiased. And that means the author doesn't need to have a special agenda at hand. They need to present all viewpoints equally and fairly, instead of casting one viewpoint in a negative light or casting another viewpoint in a positive light. So those are the two most important traits in order to be credible or believable. And in order to decide whether an author is credible, you need to look at their motivations. In other words, you need to know why they are writing the paper. If it's to persuade the reader, then you know they are not going to be very credible because they may skew certain facts to try to persuade you. But if they're just presenting information, just for the purpose of presenting information to the reader, then they are most likely credible. Almost any type of writing is descriptive, and then it seeks to describe a certain person, place, thing, or idea. But a descriptive text is more specific, and then it takes one particular subject and then tries to depict that clearly to the reader. So we could say that a descriptive text focuses on one subject. So it focuses on one subject and then tries to depict that subject clearly to the reader. And when you think of describing something, that means using lots of adjectives and adverbs, lots of descriptive words. So, as you can imagine, a descriptive text is going to have lots of adjectives and adverbs. So I'm just going to abbreviate adjective and adverb. So when you think about a descriptive text, that means it's going to include details. So you want lots of details in a descriptive text. That's what the writer is going for. So over here you have too many details. Because even though the writer is trying to include lots of details, there can be too many. But on the other end of the spectrum over here, if there's not enough details, the paper can be vague or unclear. So what the writer is trying to accomplish here is a happy medium, somewhere in the middle, where the paper is not vague or unclear. It's very clear and very precise, but there's not so many details that the reader gets bogged down in all of the extra information. So as a writer, you should look to try to go in the middle in a descriptive text. And if you're reading something, you want to read things that are descriptive where the writer has a good balance of details in the paper. A dictionary is a great resource for finding out a number of things about a particular word. All the words in a dictionary are going to be categorized in alphabetical order, which makes finding a word very easy. There are a number of components that each dictionary entry is going to have. So first of all, there's going to be a pronunciation guide. This is to help the reader understand how to say the word. There will also be a listing of the parts of speech that word can be, depending on the sentence it's in. So some words might be able to be an adjective or an adverb, and other words might always be a verb. In addition to that information, it may also include an etymology, which is the language that the word originally came from and the word's definition in that language. And then a dictionary entry will always contain the definition of the word in English. Now, while many people think that only words and definitions are included in a dictionary, you see here there's also other information. And that's because someone may look up a word in a dictionary to figure out how to pronounce it or to figure out what parts of speech it can be. So finding the definition of a word is only one of the uses for a dictionary. So down here I have a sample entry in a dictionary, and this really only contains the parts of speech and the definition of the word. So see here that well can be an adverb or noun. So right here you have the definition for well when it's an adverb, which means in a good way. And when well is a noun, it means a hole drilled into the earth. And notice here that there's the number 1. That's because there could also be a number 2. Maybe there could be 2 definitions for well when it's an adverb, or 2 definitions for well when it's a noun. Some words may always just be one part of speech. So say a word is always a noun. There could be 3 or 4, maybe even more definitions for that word when it's a noun. So all of those would be listed here in the dictionary entry. So the best way for a reader to determine which is the correct definition of a word is to replace the word in the sentence with the dictionary definition. So if the sentence says the person fell into the well, you could replace well with these 2 definitions to see which one seems correct. So the first sentence would say the person fell into, in a good way, or the person fell into a hole in the ground, or a hole drilled into the earth. So obviously here, well is a noun, so we would go with this definition of the word. The purpose of an expository passage is to enlighten and inform the reader. But to state it more simply, the purpose of an expository passage is to teach. Because the purpose of this type of passage is to teach, everything here is going to be accurate. So that's why it's always going to be in a nonfiction passage. The topic of a passage of this type is always going to be very simple. It's going to be a simple topic. It's also going to be a very easily defined topic, because the writer of one of these types of passages wants the reader to be able to understand what they're saying very easily, because they're trying to teach them something. So everything's going to be very simply stated so that the reader can understand what the writer is saying. Oftentimes, expository passages will contain words like first, next, for example, or therefore. The reason these types of words would be used is because the writer is going to make a point that talks about the topic and then back things up with certain details. So in other words, the writer is going to state a fact and then back it up with details. So he might say, this is because first, second, and finally, or next we're going to talk about this argument for our topic. Or he might give a certain example about a topic and then say, for example, or because of this, therefore. Everything is revolved around teaching. So any words like this or any other words that may go along with teaching something are going to be used in these types of situations. So the important thing to remember is that an expository passage is meant for teaching, and it's going to be nonfiction. Authors will oftentimes try to express feelings. So it's important that you as a reader recognize when an author is trying to express feelings. So first of all, let's take a look at some situations in which a writer may express their feelings. It may be when they're giving a personal story or telling about a personal situation. And personal situations are, like it sounds, very personal to them. It pertains directly to them. It's something they've experienced. So strong emotion will come out of that, and they're going to express their feelings. Often, if a writer is trying to persuade someone, then there will also be strong feelings, as the writer is trying to arouse the emotions of the reader to get them to think a certain way or to take a certain action. You can know that a writer is trying to express feelings when they use phrases like, I felt, or I sense. Here, the writer is inserting their own opinions. They're not giving facts. They're talking about their own opinions, and here they're going to be talking about feelings, because feeling something, like it says I felt, so that's a feeling, or I sensed something, that's also a feeling. So those kind of phrases can tip you off that some kind of personal emotion or personal feeling is coming. It's important that you recognize these strong emotions. Recognize when strong emotions are portrayed or when certain feelings are expressed. because you as the reader don't want to fall into the trap of giving too much sympathy to the writer. Because if you fall into the trap of falling into all the emotions of the writer, then it's going to be hard for you to look at the text objectively and try to understand the text better and to evaluate it. So you need to kind of distance yourself from the emotions of the writer so that you can evaluate what you are reading. So the important thing to remember is that an author will express feelings when talking about a personal situation or when they are trying to persuade. And it's important that you as the reader recognize these strong feelings. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. Indexes are very effective in helping readers find something specific in a book. Almost any nonfiction book will have an index, so it's important that you as a reader know how to use an index so that you can find things quickly. This is kind of what an index might look like. You'll have everything here classified in alphabetical order. Notice nothing here is classified by page number. Everything is in alphabetical order. And many times there will be a big letter A and then a big letter B and then a big letter C as you progress through the alphabet. And then everything that falls under A or B or C will be under that big letter. Notice here the first entry says John Adams. Notice that Adams comes first. It says Adams John. That's because anytime a name is in an index, the last name will come first. So out to the right of Adams John, we have the page number that you can find John Adams on. So 35 through 42, all those pages through there, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, and page 42, all have John Adams on there, as well as page 53. And if you look at Apple, Apple only appears on page 3. So now we're moving down to B, find Buchanan John. Now there's lots of things about John Buchanan, and so if all of these page numbers over here were listed, it would be difficult for the reader to find specifically what they are looking for. So John Buchanan is further broken up into achievements of, death of, and life of. And what you do here is you just take achievements of and insert it right before the main title, and you take death of and insert it right before Buchanan John. So if you're wondering why it says of at the end, that's because it's supposed to read achievements of Buchanan John, death of Buchanan John, and life of Buchanan John. So if you're looking for the achievements of Buchanan John, or John Buchanan, look for pages 42 through 44. And if you're looking for the death of him, look on page 46. And if you're looking for the life in general of John Buchanan, look at pages 39 through 46. Now, I want to show you another example. Imagine we get all the way to R, and R has red apples on it. So someone's looking specifically for red apples. Well, instead of having the page number here, it might just say C apple in parentheses. So that means you would go up here and find apple, and you see apple is on page 3. Maybe on page 3 it talks about lots of different types of apples. So it would be pointless to have red apples everywhere, and blue apples, and green apples, and purple apples with page 3 next to it. So instead, it just says see apple under it. But whoever wrote the index knew that someone might specifically look for red apples, so that's why they still put it in here. But you're just going to refer back over here to find which page number it is on. So the important thing to remember with indexes is everything is going to be in alphabetical order. Page numbers no longer matter. And if you're looking for a name, the last name is going to be put in there first. An informative text is a very straightforward piece of writing. Basically, the purpose of an informative text is to educate and enlighten the reader. It's basically to convey information from the writer to the reader. So it's very straightforward because it's not persuasive, and so it pertains more to facts and figures. So first off, an informative text is generally non-fiction because it has no reason to be fiction because it has facts and figures in it, so it's truthful. So that's why it's always non-fiction. It's generally easily comprehensible because the writer wants the reader to understand what the writer is talking about. So they want it to be easily comprehensible to the reader so that the reader can understand everything that's going on. There will also be a clear structure to the paper. Since it's informative, it'll oftentimes have several points or pertain to several things. So many times it'll go from one point to the next, a very clear structure throughout the entire paper. And like we've been saying, it'll have facts and figures in it. And so there won't be really emotional language. It'll be more straightforward. And then also, an informative text generally does not have personal opinions in it because there's no reason to have personal opinions because the writer isn't trying to convince the reader in any way. They're trying to just simply convey information to the reader. So that's why personal opinions are not present and are not needed. So the important thing to remember is that an informative text is meant to educate and enlighten the reader. A prediction is a guess about what will happen next. So when a reader actively engages in whatever they are reading, they naturally make predictions about what will happen next. And they base these predictions off of what they have read, and what they already know. So by taking what they have read and what they already know, a reader can formulate what they think will happen next in the story. So consider this sentence. Staring at the computer screen in shock, Kim blindly reached over for the brimming glass of water on the shelf to her side. So the reader is naturally going to read this and have an idea of what is going to happen next. And the reader will probably notice the word blindly. So Kim is so caught up in what's happening on the computer, she goes for a drink of water, but since she's caught up on what's going on the computer, she reaches over without really looking at the glass of water to grab it. So the reader is going to assume that she's going to knock over the glass of water. Now, that may not be what happens, but still it's a prediction either way. The prediction may come true, and a prediction may not come true. But a reader is naturally going to make predictions about a passage, and making predictions is part of being actively engaged in what the reader is reading. There are many ways to structure a particular piece of writing. One common way to organize a paper, especially in nonfiction writing, is by presenting a problem and then presenting a solution. So I'm going to write problem here and then draw an arrow to solution. Because that is how the paper or the piece of literature would be structured. First, the author would present the problem and then present the solution. Now, in some cases, the problem may already be well known to the reader. In this case, the writer may talk briefly about the solution, then talk about the problem, and then talk in more depth about the solution. Notice that I wrote solution very small here because that's how the paper would be structured. The writer would briefly talk about the solution, then talk lots about the problem and lots about the solution. In some cases, an author may feel like there are more than one viable solutions. So I'm going to write problem, then draw three arrows to solutions. So it's important when reading a paper that first presents a problem, then a solution, that you understand the author's agenda, as well as their point of view. So first of all, their agenda. You want to know why the author is writing the paper, and if they feel like one particular solution is in their best interest. So if a paper is structured like this with a problem then several solutions, the author may be biased towards one solution and feel like their solution is the best, and so they may cast the other solutions in a negative light. So they would, even though they would present several solutions, they would highlight one and put down the other solutions. In some cases, the author may present a problem and only present the solution that they feel is best, even though there are other good solutions. So sometimes only one solution is good, and so that's why the author only presents one solution. But sometimes there are more than one solutions that could be good for the problem. And so when the author only presents one solution, instead of even addressing the other solutions, they're totally ignoring them. So that's another example of an agenda and being biased towards one solution over another. So it's important that you as a reader understand both the writer's agenda and point of view when looking at the problem and the solution. When doing research, it's important to focus on primary sources, which is documentation closest to the subject being studied. Some examples of primary sources are things like photographs, recordings, or accounts of people who saw it in person. So you see here, if we were studying the subject of penguins, then some primary sources would be photographs and recordings of penguins and accounts of people who have studied penguins in person. So if I was doing research, this is what I would want to focus on. Now there are secondary sources, which would be things like a review of a movie about penguins or a book outlining the observations of others. Now notice here that a movie about penguins is a primary source and the observations of others is a primary source. But here you have a review of the movie or a book outlining the observations of others. So here you have a source about another source, and that's why it's a secondary source. So in research, that's what researchers should stay away from. There's a couple things that researchers should look out for when looking for a primary source. They should make sure that what they are looking up is credible and recent. And the second criteria right here, recent, only matters if the subject is still alive today or still going on. Like if it was research about Abraham Lincoln, it wouldn't matter if it was recent because we're not really discovering anything new about him. His life is already over. But if it was something about the government of Italy, then it would need to be recent because the government of Italy is changing because it's still existing. So that's why it's important that it be recent. It's also important that it be credible so that you know it's true. A great place for primary sources is the internet. Used to, researchers stayed away from the internet because it wasn't a credible source, but now some information on the internet is credible. The best place to look for primary sources is to look for sources affiliated with established institutions, such as universities, public libraries, and think tanks. If there's a website that's not affiliated with an established institution, see if there's links to that website from established institutions. Like if a university had a link to that website, then that website is probably also credible. Also, look to see if there's information about the author of that web page. Many times the author will include any credentials, any education or experience they might have, which increases the credibility of that person. So overall, when looking or when doing research, it's important to look for primary sources, and it's important that those primary sources are both credible and recent. The purpose of an author is basically why the writer wrote the paper. It's what motivated them to write something. So there's three basic types of motivations or purposes of an author. They either wrote something to inform, entertain, or persuade. So it's important as a reader to understand the purpose of the author because it helps you better understand the text. So generally, it's pretty easy to determine what type of paper something is. So an informative paper is basically when the reader or the writer is just giving the reader facts about something. They're telling them more about something. A paper that is meant to entertain is generally fiction. It's pretty much any kind of fiction work is meant to entertain. Now, occasionally, fiction will serve a double purpose of also trying to inform, trying to persuade. But generally, when something's meant to entertain, generally means that it's some kind of fiction piece. Then finally, the third type, or the third purpose, is to persuade. And this is actually the hardest type to determine, because generally, an author is going to try to hide that they're trying to persuade you. Because when someone knows they're trying to be persuaded, they're going to be wary or skeptical of the arguments that the writer is throwing at them. So a lot of times a writer will try to disguise their persuasive paper as a paper that's meant to inform or a paper that's meant to entertain, but actually it's meant to persuade the reader. So those are the three main types of purposes of an author: to inform, to entertain, or to persuade. A sequence is the order in which things happen. So it's important that a reader be able to identify the sequence so they can follow along with what is happening in the passage. So a sequence is basically the order in which things happen, or the order of events. To help spot the sequence in a passage, you can look for words like first, then, last, and next. So if you find these words in a passage or other words like it, you'll know that that's showing you some part of the sequence. And so that helps you determine what happened first, then next, and then last. And finally, most sequences will be in chronological order. Basically, chronological means based on time. So if I was talking about my day, I would say, okay, at 7 o'clock I got up, at 7:30 I ate breakfast, at 8 o'clock I went for a run, and then at 12 o'clock I ate lunch. See, that's chronological. It's proceeding through time. Now, some texts might not be in chronological order, and so those can be more confusing when trying to find the sequence. However, sometimes that's the best way to go about writing certain passages, so just understand that not all passages will be in chronological order, but nevertheless, it's important that you understand the sequence of events. So to practice, take a look at this sentence. He walked in the front door and switched on the hall lamp. Notice here that none of these words are present in this passage. However, you can still find what the sequence is here. So you know that he must have walked in the front door first and then switched on the light bulb. That had to happen second, because first he had to get inside the door. So this may seem like a very simple and elementary example, but it's still important to be able to identify the sequence in a passage or sentence. A stereotype is basically a bias against a specific group of people or a specific place. So you as a reader need to be attentive to when someone is using a stereotype. So like I said, a stereotype is a bias against a specific group or place. And stereotypes are generally a generalization. And a generalization is basically where you look at a specific group of people and you take what is true for some of the people and apply it to everyone. Like, take for example, if I said everyone in Nebraska is a corn farmer. Now, there are many corn farmers in Nebraska, but not everyone there is a corn farmer. So I took what was true for a few people and applied it to everyone in Nebraska. So that's a mild case of a stereotype, because most stereotypes are negative. You may have heard some negative stereotypes towards specific cultures, ethnicities, and religions. So anytime you as a reader notice a stereotype, recognize that means the author is ignorant and not curious. In other words, they may not be willing to look into the details. They see something that they think is true, and so then they state it as fact. So that's why I say they're not very curious. And they're also ignorant, because they may be aware that they are using a stereotype, but they may not care. And so they're ignorant about that, which means they're also going to be ignorant about other things. So as a reader, be attentive to when a writer is using stereotypes. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part, but without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail, and second, and give another supporting detail, and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like, for example, or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. Topics and main ideas are vital parts of a paper, so it's important that you know how to find the topic and main ideas. But first, we need to understand what those are. So a topic is a subject of a text. Basically, it's what the text is about. And the main idea is the most important point being made. So every paper includes a main idea and a topic. And every paragraph also includes a main idea and a topic. So a topic is very general. A topic is not specific at all. It just tells an overview of what the paper or the paragraph is about. So the topic of a paper could just be tennis. That's the subject of the text, or the text is about tennis. But the main idea is more specific. The main idea is like a thesis statement. It's the most important point being made in the paper. So while the topic might be tennis, the main idea would be tennis is a good form of exercise. So generally you can find the topic and main idea in the first sentence of the paper. So it might say something like, tennis is a great form of exercise. So you know there, the topic's tennis and the main idea is exercise. Or this might also be found at the beginning of a paragraph. If the paper is about something different, the paragraph may have its own topic and main idea. So the first sentence of the paragraph might be, tennis is a great form of exercise. And there, boom, you found the topic and the main idea. Some papers are more difficult and some paragraphs are more difficult, and you may have to read each sentence in that paper or paragraph and find the general theme of all those sentences, what those sentences have in common. But in general, it's very easy to find the topic. You can just scan the paper and figure out what the paper is about, and then more specifically, you can find out what the main idea of the paper is. And since the main idea is the main idea, it's the most important part of the paper, the main idea will be repeated oftentimes throughout the entire paper, generally in the introduction and in the conclusion, and sometimes in between.